Welcome everyone to our 2022 pre-conference webinar on building resilience in counties, tools and strategies. I'm Joe Lurch, Director of Local Government Policy here at VACO, and we have a group of expert panelists today. They're going to walk you through a lot of information, places to look for information, but also some strategies and tools that you can use. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce Elizabeth here from the Virginia Coastal Policy Law Clinic, who's going to be our moderator and get us started off and introduce the panelists. So Elizabeth, take it away.
Thank you, Joe. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And I want to say thank you to VACO for being willing to host this. We're excited to talk about resilience. Have, as Joe mentioned, a wonderful panel lined up. I'm going to introduce them in one moment. First, I'm going to give you a little bit of a background about building resilience. And as Joe said, I'm the director of the Virginia Coastal Policy Center at William & Mary Law School. We do a lot of work with communities about building resilience, and we're excited to put together this program today. And if you have any questions, always don't hesitate to reach out to me later. I'm at eaandrews@wm.edu. So first question that people often ask is resilience. Resilience to what? What does that mean anyway? Well, it means resilience to a lot of different things now, unfortunately, flooding and heat and wildfires and all kinds of community threats and challenges. Often definitions of resilience incorporate the idea of bouncing back, thriving, coming back better, recovering. For example, in the Virginia definition of resilience, it's the capability to anticipate, prepare for, respond to, and recover from significant multi-hazard threats with minimum damage to social well-being, health, the economy, and the environment. Notice it's not just the environment, of course. It's not just the physical setting. It's also our social well-being, health, and the economy. Those are all important components. And then that has to be taken into account for all different populations within a community, the socially and the physically vulnerable in particular. Resilience for all, you have to take into account reaching people where they are. Internet is not always the way, unfortunately, in some rural areas that may not have good connection yet. And so having community partners and trusted messengers is going to be equally important to building a resilience plan for the entire community. And resilience has to be taken into account in individual programs as well. Here is a quote from the VDOT Structure and Bridge Division, defining resiliency as the successful integration of transportation mobility, sea level rise adaptation measures, and resistance to the extreme effects of coastal storms into the design decisions. So it has to be not just an overarching resilience definition, but also one in particular for each different kind of program or initiative. So I'm going to start out quickly with a federal update about some developments on the resilience front at the federal level, and then we'll talk about state and local. And then the panelists will take that up as well. So starting out with the 2021 Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, that was a source of much discussion, as it also is the source of much funding. $550 billion in new spending over the next 5 years, which can be used for things such as protection against droughts and heat. And communities can get those funds through both formula grants and competitive grants. One important note is that there was funding in it for the Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities grant program, BRIC. Many people may have heard of that. What's important about that is that it's in addition to the funding that FEMA already provides for that program, and it can be used to build resilience in a community. For example, mitigation measures, including relocation. So it can build up capacity in a community. It's not just post-hazard recovery dollars. The Safeguarding Tomorrow Through Ongoing Risk Mitigation, or STORM Act in 2021, also got funding, and that authorizes FEMA to provide grants to states to establish revolving loan funds to provide hazard mitigation assistance to local governments. And that's to reduce risk to disasters and natural hazards. Flood mitigation assistance, and then NOAA habitat restoration and coastal resilience funding. That's particularly important in the coastal communities. 2020, this year, saw the Inflation Reduction Act. That has also gotten a lot of coverage. Many people may be familiar with it. Focused a lot on clean energy. And what I wanted to note today to everyone is the agricultural conservation funding for climate smart agriculture. There are carbon capture opportunities out there as a carbon capture trees. And so
Elizabeth, just real quick, you dropped off a little there. Could you maybe just go back a couple sentences and repeat?
sorry, I don't know why that occurred. Um,
All right.
but it does include the IRA, as we call it, did include over 20 billion in agricultural conservation funding for climate smart agriculture efforts from the USDA, and that's it's important for our rural localities to look at these carbon capture opportunities and see what might be available. Um, and I want to refer you to the National Association of Counties website, resiliency website, which is right there listed. It's a great place to go for updates and notices of federal funding opportunities, and also information on building resilience in communities. It's a really terrific site to go check out. Okay. Then there's the National Flood Insurance Program, Risk Rating 2.0. Many people are probably already familiar with that. They have tried to reform the National Flood Insurance Program to more closely reflect the risks of an individual property in the rates. It was launched for new policies, new flood insurance policies on October 1st, 2021, and then expanded to policyholders in April of this year. It incorporates more flood risk data variables to reflect accurately a property's individual flood risk, including frequency and types of flooding, elevation, replacement cost to rebuild, whether it's riverine or storm surge flooding, coastal erosion, heavy rainfall. So it takes into account many more factors and is going to result in lower premiums, they estimate, for 1.2 million property owners. So some will have higher premiums, some will have lower. At the state level, the Hampton Roads Sanitation District has the SWIFT project, which is the Sustainable Water Initiative for Tomorrow. And that's where they're treating wastewater discharge water to the potable level and injecting it into the groundwater aquifer to help replenish our water supply. It has been in a testing mode for a number of years now. The research center is open and replenishing the Potomac aquifer, and it contributes to a number of important goals, including the restoration of our Chesapeake Bay water quality by reducing the nutrient discharges, helping to deal with sea level rise and land subsidence, creating a flooding issue because it can help to stop our land subsidence that's occurring from overuse of our aquifer. And when you increase the pressure in the aquifer, you can reduce the saltwater intrusion into the water supply. So it serves a lot of important roles there. Also, the Community Flood Preparedness Fund is a very important development in the state. It's a non-reverting fund that was created by the General Assembly in 2020. And it's intended to fund community scale projects. Localities and planning district commissions and tribes can apply for funding. And it is fed by funding that comes from the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative auctions. And 45% of the proceeds from those auctions go into the Community Flood Preparedness Fund. The third round just occurred this past month, and the Department of Conservation and Recreation awarded 27 grants with 32 proposals asked to give some additional information and given a 60-day extension. The schedule has not yet been set for the fourth round of funding, looking at early 2023, but an important note is that DCR is looking at loans as well as grants this round. And last June, the grants manual update did include incentives for projects that use natural or nature-based features, another important point. The Resilient Virginia Revolving Loan Fund was also created by the legislature, and Delegate Bulova will cover that in a moment. I just want to note that the difference between these two funds is primarily about the intended audience. The revolving loan fund, the revolving fund is available for residential, commercial, and industrial properties. The Community Flood Preparedness Fund is directed towards community scale projects. And then last of all, I want to note the Virginia Coastal Resilience Technical Advisory Committee, which was created in state code at section 10.1-659 of the state code. And it's continued. It was under the last administration and then continued in code by the legislature. And it's established to assist with developing, updating, and implementing the Virginia Coastal Resilience Master Plan. And that it's required by code to be updated by December of 2024. This technical advisory committee also may be called upon to help DCR with the development and updating of the Virginia Flood Protection Master Plan. We had our first meeting in September. The RAFT, some communities may have heard of this. It's the Resilience Adaptation Feasibility Tool. It's a partnership between my center at William & Mary Law School and Old Dominion University, Institute for Coastal Adaptation and Resilience, and the University of Virginia's Institute for Engagement and we work with communities. We score their programs and initiatives for how resilient they are. And then we work with the community for a year. Checklist of items that they develop to become more resilient over that year. The important point is it's community driven. It gets down into the grassroots level. We have monthly meetings for a year of an implementation team from each locality. One important point about that is that we work in partnership with the Planning District Commission because they're the ones with the feet on the ground and the credibility, and they know what their localities need. So we worked first in partnership with the Accomack Northampton Planning District Commission on the Eastern Shore, then the Northern Neck Planning District Commission, now with the Middle Peninsula Planning District Commission. And next we're starting out with the Crater Planning District Commission, looking at working with Hopewell and Petersburg. That is a tool that is available to communities as well. Concerning heat, which is one of the things we need to be resilient to, the increasing heat. There's a new extreme heat model at the property scale that was developed by the First Street organization, and it has 30-year projections. So I want to make you aware of that tool. Concerning the chronic flooding that we're experiencing, I think Dr. Molly Mitchell from the Virginia Institute of Marine Science will go into some of their tools in a moment, including their ADAPT VA website with sea level rise projection data. And they also developed under a NOAA grant, a tool to help localities determine where best to place natural and nature-based features. And then Marissa, the Mid-Atlantic Regional Integrated Sciences and Assessments group, came out with some fact sheets on fascinating topics like projected changes in precipitation, stretches of high heat days, future precipitation impacts on stormwater management. So those are some important tools for localities as well. And then finally, we are partnering Wetlands Watch and my center, the Coastal Policy Center, are partnering with the Virginia chapter of the American Planning Association to host monthly lunchtime webinars about climate change related topics. We started them in June. They are hosted on the APA YouTube site, so you can access them. We talked about flooding. Dr. Molly Mitchell came, and a VDOT representative talked about how they're dealing with sea level rise and flooding. And we had Mike Rolband, the director of the Department of Environmental Quality, talking about increasing precipitation and impacts on stormwater management and erosion and sediment control. We had Professor Johnny Finn from the Christopher Newport University talking about housing impacts. And then we're going to have an additional one on October the 24th. And we'll be talking about the community rating system and what some communities are doing about that. Concerning sudden emergency events, a tool that can help, talking about hurricanes, tornadoes, unnamed rain bomb events, which can occur. NOAA has $1 billion disasters mapping tool. Unfortunately, that's needed now. And it gets down to the census tract level, accessing social vulnerability index data. And you could see the combined risks on that tool. So it's an important help. And then NOAA has a climate and hazard mitigation planning, or CHAMP tool. And that one can help you to find the historical and the projected data by county for extreme heat, tropical storms, severe weather, hurricanes, etc. So that's an important one as well. And you can find data trends with that. And then finally, I wanted to bring to your attention an infrastructure funding navigator site. It's a beta of a tool that's out there. You can go to the website and check it out. And it's a way to access information on multiple federal funding programs. They filter 350 plus federal infrastructure funding and financing programs, including those approved by the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, so as well as legacy programs. So it's an interesting tool to try out, and you might be interested by that. Stop sharing. introduce our wonderful panelists today, and we so appreciate you being here with us. First, we'll hear from Dr. Molly Mitchell with the Virginia Institute of Marine Science. She's a research assistant professor there, and she focuses on shifts in coastal resources due to the interaction of sea level rise and human-driven changes. She works at the intersection of multiple disciplines and with representatives from many different groups to help translate research and current scientific understanding into practical recommendations. These include localities, state agencies, regional entities such as the Chesapeake Bay Program's Climate Resilience Work Group, and global organizations such as the Sea Level Rise Working Group for the World Climate Research Program Safe Landing Lighthouse activity. She'll have to tell us more about that. Dr. Mitchell was awarded a 2019 U.S. Clivar Early Career Leadership Award for her climate change communication efforts. Thank you for being here today. And then we'll hear from Lewie Lawrence, who is the Executive Director for the Middle Peninsula Planning District Commission, as well as Secretary and Lead Planner for the Middle Peninsula Chesapeake Bay Public Access Authority, which has ended up to be a very innovative tool in the resilience realm. Lewie has grown up on the shores of the Chesapeake Bay in Virginia and is continuing his 150 plus year family tradition of public service in protecting the Bay's health. His entire professional career has focused on coastal zone management for the community that his family has resided in for 3 centuries. Recipient of numerous national and state awards for innovation in community planning and problem solving at the local and regional level, he specializes in applied local and regional planning and policy development. And he's actually here today to talk about innovation, so that's appropriate. It's in his introduction. Through his work with the Virginia legislature, shorelines owned by private homeowners and waterfront businesses can now access revolving loan funds to finance the construction of living shorelines. In addition, Lewie coordinated the Middle Peninsula's innovative Fight the Flood program, which is here to talk about today, designed as a web-based service, which includes a toolbox containing financial products, design professionals, contractors, and flood education material necessary to achieve the region's flood protection and resilience needs in an organized and efficient manner. And that's the first program of its kind in the nation that provides concrete assistance and access to financial and mitigation services for rural, private, and public property owners. And that allows them to solve their own flooding challenges and build more resilient communities, thus increasing safety and reducing the loss of the tax base. And I will let him go into all the details further about the program, but it's truly an innovative regional approach from the PDC. Delegate David Bulova will be our third panelist, and he represents the 37th District in the House of Delegates, which includes the city of Fairfax and portions of Fairfax County. First elected in 2005, David serves on the Appropriations, General Laws, and Agriculture, Chesapeake, and Natural Resources Committees. He's also appointed to the State Water Commission and the Chesapeake Bay Commission. Prior to being elected to the House, David was an elected member of the Northern Virginia Soil and Water Conservation District Board. David and his wife Gretchen both grew up in Fairfax County, as did I, and have 3 children. He received a BA in government from the College of William & Mary and a master's in public administration and policy from Virginia Tech. And he is a 1997 graduate of the Sorensen Institute for Political Leadership, Political Leaders Program. Professionally, he works as a project manager for WSP Environment and Infrastructure, specializing in water, resources, policy, planning, and finance. So with that, I'm going to hand it to you, Molly, and I would ask when you're done if Lewie can take up speaking next and then Delegate Bulova last. Thank you all.
Great, thank you so much. I'm going to share my screen. So I'm going to talk today about sea level rise and flooding and how these processes are changing in Virginia, what we expect to see, and then what are some of the impacts of this, and also where you can find some of this information to learn more about it. Okay, so what's happening in Virginia? We have a lot of different processes going on, and they're all kind of coming together to increase our flooding impacts. So as air temperature increases, that increases the water temperature. Now, as the water temperature increases, we get 2 processes that are happening on a global scale. So globally, we get thermal expansion of the water as water molecules heat up, they move faster. And as they move faster, they take up more space. So this is why a pressure cooker works, because the water is increasing the volume of area it's taking up. So this is happening in our oceans. And so the amount of area that water takes up is expanding somewhat. The other thing that's happening is we have melting ice sheets and glaciers. So this is the one you hear about in the news most frequently. And as water that is stored on land is entering the ocean, we have more water in the ocean. I put melting ice sheets here, but this is true too if we take water out of aquifers and we return it to the ocean, or if water evaporates out of ponds, freshwater sources on land, and then rains down in the ocean. So there are a couple of different ways really where we can increase the volume of water in the ocean. So the melting ice sheets, in combination with the increased water temperature and changes in the air pressure system, have resulted in changing ocean circulation. And this is really important for the Atlantic coast of the United States because part of this ocean circulation pattern is the Gulf Stream, which comes up from Florida along the Atlantic coast, and right at the mouth of the Chesapeake Bay, it turns out into the ocean where it continues on up into the Greenland area. So the circulation pattern has been slowing down over time and it's been moving slightly offshore. And when that happens, it changes the distribution of water from the shoreline to the Gulf Stream. So the slower it goes, the lower the Gulf Stream portion is and the higher up the shoreline is. So what we're getting is we're getting a shift in the way water is distributed. The water surface is flattening out a little bit, and that's resulting in higher water levels along the Atlantic coast. Now, at the same time as that, we also have subsidence going on. So that's the land sinking. And there's two types of subsidence that occur. One is groundwater withdrawal, or hydrocarbon gas and oil withdrawals. So this is a problem in various places around the United States. It is also an issue in Virginia, although it's not a huge issue compared to some other locations in the United States. The other process we have is this long-term tectonic process called glacial isostatic rebound. And this is where back in the last ice age, ice sheets, which were really, really heavy, pushed down on the crust of the continental US. And Virginia, which is on the same crust as the New England area, which was the edge of that ice sheet. So Virginia bulged up and New England got squashed down. And over time, we've been very, very slowly going back towards level. But the result is that relative to sea level, which is coming up anyway, the land is sinking slightly. So that makes the rate of sea level rise higher. The other thing that's happening is as we have increasing air temperature, we're getting changing precipitation patterns. Most notably, we are getting more high intensity rainfall events. So when that happens, and we have sea level rise, we get this perfect nexus for flooding to occur. In our coastal areas, the sea level flooding, so the tidal flooding and storm surge from hurricanes and that kind of thing, tends to cause the biggest floods, although we have a lot of precipitation flooding, particularly on our roadways and that kind of thing. Out on the western part of the state, where we have all the mountains, we have a lot of topography, these changing precipitation patterns are impacting riverine flooding. So we're going to talk a little bit about both of those processes today. Okay, so where are we headed? This graph is from a tide gauge down in Norfolk at Sewell's Point. It's one of the older tide gauges in the country, really. It goes back to 1928. And the blue line you're seeing here is the pattern of the observed mean sea level since 1969. And you can see that it goes up and down a little bit, but the general trend is upward. So if we draw a line through that trend to see where we're headed, we can see that we have the solid orange line is the trend through that observed sea level from the tide gauge. And then the dotted orange lines are the expected annual variability. So I said sea level goes up and down around that line. So we expect that to continue out in the future. And that is what those orange lines are showing you. So if we look at this, we see that we're expecting water levels to be at about 1.5 feet in AVD 88 by 2050. If the future processes occur the same way that the past 40 years have occurred. If, however, things change rapidly, like temperatures speed up more quickly than we thought, or ice sheets melt more rapidly, then we have to look at global models to understand what will happen. And so we can look at, these are the NOAA's 2017 global model results. So you can see they have this solid blue line there as their intermediate curve, and that's pretty close to what we've been seeing over the past 40 years in Virginia. So that's kind of along the projection from what the tide gauges are giving us. However, if ice sheets melt much, much faster than we expected, the potential for higher water levels are there. So up to 5.5 feet, maybe in AVD 88 by 2050, and up to 11 feet by 2100 would be the kind of worst case scenarios from these models. So what does this mean for flooding? So obviously, higher high tides are a big problem. The other thing we're concerned about is when big storm surge events come in. So these are significant Virginia tidal floods. These are the gauges. And then this is the biggest storm surge that has reached that gauge and the date of the storm in which it came in. And this is the second biggest and so forth. I've circled two of the storms just so you can kind of see. This is the fourth biggest storm at the DC gauge. It is the biggest storm at the Sewell's Point gauge. So it's just about 7 feet in DC. This is the same storm. And it's 5.5 feet in Sewell's Point. So I just want to make the point here that in terms of storm surge, what we know is that storm surge is going to be higher, right? If sea level is 1.5 feet higher in 2050, then a 6-foot storm coming in on top of that, a storm surge coming in on top of that would be a 7-foot storm surge, right? Or a 7.5-foot storm surge. But that the actual impact really depends on what the tide level is. Are we at high tide or low tide, and which way the winds are blowing? So that's why, even though this is the same storm, the surge was much bigger in DC than it was down at Sewell's Point for the same storm. And you can see the same thing for this 2006 storm that was the highest one at Louisetta, and it was only the 7th highest that Gloucester Point saw because it came in at different points in the tide range, or the wind was blowing in different directions. So we know that storm surges will be worse. Saying exactly how bad it will be in a particular area is very difficult. So we need to, keep in mind a margin of error, some caution when we look at future projections for floods. Now, riverine flooding is actually a little more difficult to predict. So what I'm showing you here is the change in high intensity rain events. And this is the website for the tool if you want to go take a look. Elizabeth mentioned it earlier. So this is, I'm showing the 100-year storm, and it's return under the high climate scenario RCP 8.5. So what we expect to see in 24 hours is an increase of maybe an inch of rain. Well, actually, even at the 12-hour mark, we expect to see maybe an inch of rain increase at this station in the next, say, 50 years, 30 to 50 years. So what does that mean in terms of flooding is actually very difficult to say. This is from the weather.gov. You can go and look at significant fluvial floods that have occurred. I'm not going to read through the slide. What I want you to notice is that, there's a number of inches, okay, on each of these. And then there's the rise in water level that occurred with that inches. So 6 to 14 inches of rain over a 2-day period for this storm resulted in a 19-foot rise in water levels in the city of Roanoke. So a 1-inch increase in the amount of rain could actually result in a substantial increase in the amount of flooding, depending on how big the watershed it is, how big of an area of the watershed it falls in. So it's hard to say exactly how big those floods will be with a 1-inch increase, but we can assume it will be feet of increase in flooding potential. Okay, so now I'm going to show you some tools that you can use to look at. Right now, these are all looking at tidal flooding, storm surge flooding. So they're coastal predominantly. And these can be found on a .va, and you can find it as either a .va.com or a .va.org. So there's a lot of information on this website, including the NNBF tools that Elizabeth mentioned, which I'm not going to show you today. But there's a lot of information on this website that you can get. This is a project we did looking at road flooding, and this is the Middle Peninsula of Virginia here. It's actually, but we have data for the entire coastal plain. And these blue coverages are showing how much flooding is occurring, the duration of flooding. So the lightest areas only flood during very big storm events. Okay, so really, really high storm events. And the darkest areas flood on a daily basis. These are intertidal areas, the darkest ones. And the color of the road tells you how frequently the road is inaccessible. So these pink ones become inaccessible when the water reaches about 3 feet high. You won't be able to access any of these. Whereas the red ones don't become inaccessible until we have about 9 feet of flooding. So that would be a really big storm event coming through. The important thing to consider is that, well, there's two important things here on the slide. One is that sometimes the houses or the downstream part of the road is not flooded, but there's some point where the road crosses a bridge or that kind of thing that cuts off access to the road. So that's a really important consideration, not just to look at what areas are flooded, but what areas are inaccessible. The other thing to consider is this road here does cross some bridges and it does get cut off, but the entire road continues to be accessible because it has another entrance pathway. So redundancy seems to improve the outcome for flooded roads. These are looking at septic issues. Septic systems don't work well when they're in saturated soil. So as sea level rises, it pushes up the groundwater and causes septic failures. It's not the only thing that causes septic failures. They can age out of the system, or it can be through poor maintenance, that kind of thing. So we've done a project for the Virginia Department of Health where we have mapped areas. These little squares are hotspots of septic repair permits. So these are areas where you would have more repair permits than you would expect based on the surrounding areas, okay? And the different colors are just different types of hotspots. This was a 9-year series, so was it in all 9 years that this was a hotspot of repair permits, or was it just in some of those 9 years? So that's kind of our current condition. And you can see it goes up to Richmond. So it goes up to about the Falls line currently, but we are planning to expand this out to the rest of the state. So hopefully within a year, there'll be information for the rest of the state. The other thing that's shown here is this blue coverage. Okay, so this is not areas that are underwater. This is areas where you don't have enough separation between the land and the groundwater table for a septic system, a conventional septic system, to function properly. And so the dark blue areas are areas where currently you don't have that enough separation. The medium blue are the ones where we project that by 2040, that separation won't exist. And the light blue are the areas where we project that by 2080, that separation will no longer exist. And you can see little purple dots in there. Each one of those dots is a building address. So these would be places where frequently there are existing septic systems. And so you can start to see how as sea level rises, some of our properties will either have to put in alternative systems that don't use conventional drains or find another solution. And the last thing I want to show you is some work we've done looking at changes in tidal marshes. So as precipitation increases, we get more runoff. So we get more nitrogen, phosphorus brought into our watersheds, more sediments brought into our watersheds. Our marshes are really important to not just as habitat for marine animals, which is important, but they're also important for helping to remove the nitrogen and phosphorus and sediments from the waterway. So we've done analysis looking at how marshes are likely to change with sea level rise based on their amount of erosion occurring at the front edge of them, their ability to migrate inland. And so this is a classification which shows you for the light colored ones, they're not very vulnerable. So they have room to migrate, at least enough to compensate for the erosion occurring at the front edge. And then the darker pink color ones are ones where they're highly vulnerable and we're concerned about their persistence in the long term. This is not found on a DAT-VA, although the rest of the things I've shown you are. This is actually found on a tool called WetCat on DEQ's website. Okay, so the takeaway message is that flood risk is increasing in both coastal and inland Virginia. And although the drivers are a little different, it's more the sea level rise issue in coastal Virginia and it's more the precipitation issue in inland Virginia. Both areas are seeing an increased risk in flooding. We are already seeing impacts to our infrastructure. And we anticipate these impacts are going to increase rapidly. Sea level change is accelerating, and these big, heavy precipitation events seem to be occurring much more frequently. So as that happens, we're going to see a rapid increase in the impacts to communities. Thank you. And I'll hand it over to Lewie.
All right, thank you very much. So Joe, I'll get you to bring up that one slide. While he is doing that, I want to welcome all the elected officials who've taken time out of their busy schedules to listen and learn a little bit. Today, we're going to talk some about the relationship between water and the responsibilities that you all have as elected officials to protect public health, safety, and welfare, and how this collision between your duty as an elected official to your constituents is going to become a little bit more complicated. So we look at this issue, any threat that comes against the ability for you to generate taxable revenue is a real and present danger to the ability for local governments to finance governmental operations. In rural coastal Virginia, in particular, the general source of tax revenue comes from higher dollar waterfront property facing the waterfront. Most coastal communities are one road deep, and that's it. So any pressure that is applied to the waterfront tax base causes significant limitations for local government to fund essential governmental services. So as Molly had talked about, water comes in all different shapes and sizes: storm surge, sunny day flooding, rain, but it's the common enemy. And that common enemy impacts and touches all land of all shapes in the floodplain. And so we generally talk about it in terms of water is literally and figuratively chewing up the tax base. And it's become a coastal cancer. And so it's grain by grain, slowly changing the way that your local governments generate taxable revenue. So we're going to talk first about Matthews County as an indicator jurisdiction. So what's currently been happening in Matthews and will continue to happen in Matthews will soon be happening to many other coastal jurisdictions along the Chesapeake Bay, and or manifesting the same types of economic stressors in inland communities through rain flooding. or riverine flooding, which is a different type of flooding than tidal flooding. So Matthews lost $65 million in its last real estate reassessment process. When that happened, we began to look at, well, what's really causing that significant erosion in value? And what we learned was that houses on the waterfront were generally holding value, but the land itself was losing value. And we probably did an analysis of about 15 different watersheds in Matthews County. 100% of all land area in those watersheds lost significant taxable value. Most recently, Climate Central put out locality specific studies looking at the relationship between water and stressors on your ability to generate revenue. So in Matthews County in particular, they've got a little over 5,000 parcels that are inside of the annual flood risk zone, and that's by 2030. 2050, that number goes to almost 6,000 parcels. And then 2100, that's 7,000 parcels in Matthews County. That's 58% of all parcels in Matthews County will be subject to recurrent flooding. That pressure will significantly complicate the ability for local government to generate taxable revenue. So today, there are 430 acres in Matthews that are adjacent to the mean low watermark. In 2050, all of that land area becomes state-owned bottomland. So that means Matthews is going to permanently lose over 400 acres of taxable real estate. If you look at the taxable land book value of those 400 acres, that's $11.7 million of lost assessed real estate. Every turn that we look at water, it's going to complicate local officials' ability to generate revenue. It becomes a regressive tax structure. Climate issues are a regressive tax structure. When local governments go to equalize the tax levy, what this means is that inland property owners are going to end up having to pay more in taxable revenue than what they used to pay because they have to offset the lost revenue that the front properties were once generating. So the problem of revenue generation is going to run rampant as local governments begin to figure out, how do we keep schools funded, keep criminals in jail, and deal with solid waste? 8 years ago, my commission issued a directive to my staff. They said, Lewie, don't let your people drown on your watch. They directed us to develop programs and services to protect people and to protect the tax base. That's where we developed the Fight the Flood program. That program connects those that are suffering from flood challenges with companies who can provide specialized solutions to whatever flooding challenge you happen to have. For those of you all that are also in rural communities, you generally don't have a very deep bench when you're talking about access to companies that can provide specialized services. We have collected and aggregated over 25 companies existing from Canada all the way to Maine that are all the way to Miami, that are currently providing different types of flood mitigation services within the Middle Peninsula. So we went out and found the best of the best and convinced them that it made good sense to locate and provide your business operations within the Middle Peninsula. We did this by building out an ecosystem that began to connect financial products with the needs that constituents have around flood mitigation solutions and the companies that rely on that money to build the solutions that they have. So once you begin to connect federal and state resources together in a way that provides citizens with access to financial products and companies are the beneficiaries of it, you've created a mini ecosystem that allows for really creative solutions to happen that in the end protect the tax base of the jurisdiction. So right now, we're already capitalized at over $3 million in revolving loan funds. So we can finance any type of shoreline project that is permitted as a living shoreline, and any aspect of that project that is associated with that permit, we can now finance for homeowners. And as fast as we have been capitalized by VRA, we lend out all the money. So we've gone through a couple $250,000 loans The second loan we lent out in 2 days. After we closed on that loan, we were completely out of money. So VRA came back in DEQ and recapitalized our region at $3 million. And so we closed on that loan maybe about 6 months ago. We were probably already working on anywhere between $200,000 to $400,000 worth of loans that private citizens need to protect their properties right now. We also supplement homeowners' needs with grants as we can find, and there are many different grant sources that are out there. So you can begin to blend grant and loan money together to really change the trajectory of how and what types of solutions that homeowners have. To give you a little bit more scale about what we're talking about, in the last 3 years of the Fight the Flood program, we have provided over $20 million in grants and loans into the flood mitigation space to address flooding challenges at the parcel scale. So when you're probably thinking about it in terms of a capital budget, $20 million is a big number, but it's not a significantly large number. When you begin to apply that number at the individual residential parcel scale, that's a significant improvement over how we were approaching flood mitigation historically. Every penny that is spent managing flooding buys time and protects the tax base for local government. It supports the local marine contractors for those that do the work, so you're building a stronger workforce. The Fight the Flood program has essentially built a system that's transferable to any coastal community, for that matter, any community in the US. We built it to be movable. You can pick it up, move it, drop it down in your own community, and you've got the ability to figure out how do we approach a problem of this kind of scale in an ordered and measured approach that results in protecting the tax base and protecting the investment of homeowners along the waterfront. That's how the Fight the Flood program generally works. I guess I can turn it over to David, and he can close with his thoughts on it, and then we can take some questions. So thank you all very much.
Marvelous. Thank you very much, Lewie. Always hard to go ahead and follow you and Molly and Elizabeth. But I'm excited to be here and part of the discussion. And I also want to just thank all the local elected officials as well as their staff. You know, this is where the rubber hits the road with respect to coastal resiliency and determining how we're going to go ahead and take some of these bigger ideas and implement them on the ground. So really appreciate all your hard work. So I was asked to transition from the world of science and policy to the fun world of politics and talk a little bit about the 2022 session, some of the progress that we've made moving forward with respect to resilience issues, and then put on my crystal ball to go ahead and look into what might be coming up in the 2023 session. And as much as I've been around, I've been elected since 2005. It never ceases to amaze me that people kind of throw things in. You're like, where the heck did that come from? So we'll do my best to kind of give a little bit of a heads up on what we might be able to expect coming up. My hope, honestly, for being part of this conversation is to get people to be thinking about what has worked, what has not worked, and then to go ahead and inundate Joe Lurch with ideas for how we can go ahead and make things better for legislation and also the budget. So there is a method or method to this madness that I do want it to result in something actionable. And so please do follow up if you have ideas. The neat thing about resilience is that it is a surprisingly resilient bipartisan issue. And so as I was sitting there listening to Governor Northam's outgoing speech and also listening to Governor Youngkin's incoming speech, something really struck me that while there were a lot of differences with respect to where they were coming from, the one area where there was strong commonality and strong commitment was on resilience planning and also funding our resilience efforts. And so that kind of gave me a lot of hope with respect to being able to continue to push this issue forward. But it's for good reason, that both of our outgoing and incoming governor are focusing on this. And so, one is that, it is something that affects people very personally, affects their livelihood, it affects them in very, very personal ways. The other one is that this is very big with respect to its impact on our economy. Virginia's coasts, I think, as you heard, are among some of the most vulnerable, certainly in the United States, if not in the world. And it has huge economic consequences. And so one of the most recent studies that came out from Old Dominion University placed the cost of inaction at about $80 billion through the end of this century. And so those are really, really big impacts that we absolutely cannot ignore. It's important, I think, to understand that we're not starting from scratch, right? So there is a legislative history to resilience issues. And so over the last couple of years, we have made some pretty significant progress setting the foundation. And so we have appointed a chief resilience officer, so that is in the Code of Virginia, and it's good to have a person to kind of focus that accountability on to make sure that we're marshaling all of our forces and trying to push them in one direction. As was mentioned a couple different times, we do have the Community Flood Preparedness Fund, which has just been an absolutely critical resource that I know has been used up in my neck of the woods, as well as other areas across Virginia to help out with some very tangible projects. And then we have the Coastal Resilience Master Plan Phase 1. And I love the fact that even in the title of that master plan, that it's acknowledged that this is one step in an ongoing process and not just kind of the end of the line with respect to we've developed a report, here you go. With these building blocks in place, we had a unique opportunity back during the summer of 2021 to pull together a really good group of individuals to look at where is it that we needed to go next. And so, that included our regional commissions, our planning district commissions, certainly included VACO, Department of Conservation and Recreation, William & Mary's Coastal Policy Center, Bay Commission and Bay Foundation, and just a whole wide range of organizations really stepped up to the plate to say, hey, it's great that we've gotten this far. Where do we go next? And it was really that collaborative approach and process, as well as giving ourselves enough time to work through some of those issues, that we were able to come up with a suite of legislative items for the 2022 session that by and large made it through, which is pretty good. Not without some discussion or a little bit of controversy, but it's rare these days when you can take a look at an issue area like this and see some of the progress that we've made in such a short period of time. And just to put them into a couple different buckets as far as what we did in 2022 that I think would be of interest to VACO's members. The first one is continuing to move along with respect to that accountability issue. And so again, we really desperately wanted to make sure that Coastal Resilience Master Plan was a living document. And so while it wasn't on my introduction, actually my first professional career was as the coastal planner program manager for the Northern Virginia Regional Commission. So I've still got a lot of planner in me, and it breaks this planner's heart if you've got a really good plan that sits on a shelf and collects dust. And that's something that we absolutely cannot let happen with respect to our Coastal Resilience Master Plan. And so we did put in place a couple of different things to ensure that that didn't happen. And so Elizabeth mentioned that we codified the Coastal Resilience Technical Advisory Committee. Again, that was put together by executive order, but now that is actually enshrined in the Code of Virginia. And that's great. We just have so many wonderful resources in Virginia, technical resources, policy resources. Being able to pull them all together with the expectation that this is an ongoing process is really huge and really meaningful. The other thing that we did was establishing a hard deadline for not only updating that plan by 2024, but just like any locality has to look at its comprehensive plan every 5 years, ensuring that we were doing the same thing for coastal resiliency. And so putting that on a 5-year cycle. And then finally, making sure that the governor and the General Assembly understood where we were. And so the code now specifically states that the Chief Resilience Officer has to provide a report out to the governor and the General Assembly on the status of flooding and resiliency efforts every 2 years. And so all those things really, I think, will help to make sure that this continues to be at the forefront and that we have a clear understanding as policymakers where we need to go next in order to go ahead and protect Virginia's assets. And so this was House Bill 516 and 517. I was very happy to go ahead and sponsor those two. I guess I have to give some credit to the Senate, although it breaks my heart to have to go ahead and do that. But Linwood Lewis and Dave Marsden over on the Senate side really did some very heavy lifting over there as well to put that together. The other item that I think was really important was to look at this issue from a holistic standpoint. And this really picks up on what Lewie and Molly were saying, is that we've focused so heavily on coastal issues that we have forgotten that we have just as pressing issues with respect to inland flooding caused by more frequent and more severe storms coming through in Virginia. In fact, a lot of the big headlines recently, I haven't focused on sea level rise impacts in Hampton Roads or along the coastal areas. It's been those huge flooding events that have impacted so many families out in our great Southwest. And so we wanted to turn our attention to, again, making sure we kept the eye on the prize with respect to coastal resilience, but also expanding, our resiliency planning efforts to be statewide. There actually had been a requirement in the Code of Virginia, a pre-existing requirement that Virginia put together a flood master plan that was passed in 2015 by then Delegate Chris Stolley. But I think in kind of a case study of if you don't put in deadlines, if you don't put in budget money, things don't happen. And that's exactly was the case with Delegate Stolley's piece of legislation, which is it said the Department of Conservation and Recreation shall develop this plan. No deadline, no budget, plan never got developed. And so we put in legislation, and that was passed and signed in by the governor that directs DCR to also put together in tandem with that Coastal Resilience Master Plan of Virginia Flood Protection Master Plan, and for that plan to be developed by 2026, again, with that being updated every 5 years after that. And so I thought that was really good that we were looping in the rest of Virginia and making it clear that, hey, we all have a stake in what happens with respect to climate issues. The last two pieces of the puzzle really came down to funding and also transparency. And so on the funding side, we had two things kind of at the fore that we were really concerned about. And so one was, okay, Governor Youngkin has made it clear that he's not a big fan of the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. What if that money goes away? It would be very difficult to replace that full money with general funds. In fact, I can guarantee you that's not going to go ahead and happen. And so we need another mechanism out there in order to be able to help finance some of these programs. The second part is that a lot of the infrastructure is privately held. And I was just down in the Hampton Roads area earlier this week for an appropriations committee retreat where we took a tour of Newport News shipbuilding. And it was very abundantly clear that this was a major piece of Virginia's economy, our infrastructure, but it's privately held. And so we need to make sure that we're able to help our private partners also go ahead and plan for and build up against the potential impacts of sea level rise. And so that was the impetus behind that second piece of the finance puzzle. So we knew the community flood grant program, again, super important, but it needed kind of that second part, which was that Resilient Virginia Revolving Loan Fund that allowed us to be able to stretch those dollars even further and also to be able to involve our commercial, industrial, and other private interests. And that was ultimately capitalized at $25 million. That leads nicely in terms of a segue to kind of that final piece, which is transparency. And so when you're dealing with that kind of money, the question always comes down to who gets to make those decisions about where the money goes to and how are those decisions organized. And so that's an area where while we had a lot of agreement on the other factors that I was just talking about, there was not as much agreement with respect to how do we go ahead and deal with transparency in the organization of all this. And so that's kind of the subject of ongoing studies. But there are really three competing models out there. You've got the Department of Conservation and Recreation can handle these items administratively. That's how it's done now. That's ultimately how things kind of panned out during this legislative session. You could have the Soil and Water Conservation Board handle it, and so they are outward facing. They're required by law to have public hearings and to be open in that way. That was an approach that was championed by Senator Linwood Lewis. And then you could go one step further and say, hey, this is so important that we need to have a whole new authority that would take a look at these issues and pull all the pieces together. And that was the approach that was introduced by Delegate Rob Bloxham. And so ultimately what happened is it fell back to DCR for the time being as a result of some of the governor's budget or amendments to the original legislation with a work group put together to come up with some recommendations about how all of this would ultimately be organized. And so that's to be determined. In the meanwhile, though, with respect to transparency, I do want to say thank you to Director Matt Wells with the Department of Conservation and Recreation, who did take the issue of transparency seriously and put together a letter to all the different stakeholders saying, hey, understand the need to go ahead and make decisions about the community flood preparedness grant fund as open as possible, and here are the steps we're going to go ahead and take. And one of the bills also included a requirement that DCR develop a community outreach and engagement plan. And so realizing that we have a lot of great professionals and elected leaders that understand what's going on, the idea was that we needed to bring even more voices to the table so that they understood exactly what the impacts are, the risks, the likelihood of risks, and how to make sure that we're dealing with this in an equitable fashion. So just quickly moving on to the 2023 session. And so some of this is going to be a little bit of a Groundhog Day effect. So we do tend to redo issues in the General Assembly with little twists here and there. And so I suspect that we will continue that discussion about oversight and management and buy-in. And so while we do have that work group that's ongoing, with respect to how to organize decision-making with respect to resiliency. Like I said, we got 140 of us, and every one of us has the ability to go ahead and exercise our own judgment and throw in a bill. And so I wouldn't be surprised if we did have some legislation with regard to how these things are organized or to deal with transparency in the decision-making process. I think the funding element will probably be the biggest thing that we're dealing with. And so there's really two questions, in my mind, or that are kind of driving the conversation. So even if things just stayed the same, would funding that we have for the Resilient Virginia loan program be enough? And I think probably not, right? I think one of the criticisms is that $25 million, while it seems like a lot of money, is a drop in the bucket when you're talking about some of these really, really big resiliency projects. And so I think even outside of anything else, we would have to take a look and see if 25 million was enough, or whether we need to really do a better job of capitalizing that program to make it useful to our local partners and our regional partners. The follow-up question on that is, if we jump out of RGGI, do we have enough funding? Is 25 million enough for the Resilient Virginia Revolving Loan Fund? And the answer for that is absolutely not. So again, we would really need to rethink the role of that fund if we were to lose, the grant program and not able to fund that through the general fund. A lot of this, of course, is going to get swept up into ongoing debates about the budget. And so, the budget going into this next session is looking relatively healthy. And, just kind of like we had last year, you're going to see that tension between, hey, do we want to use this money for tax breaks or to redo our tax structure versus making sure that we are putting in investments to infrastructure and to critical programs like this. And so I think you'll see that same debate play out in 2023. And then the last thing I wanted to just mention is local planning. And so the best state plan, the state best regional plan in the world is going to be absolutely meaningless if we don't have good local planning in order to be able to build on those, as well as the technical capabilities necessary to be able to identify projects and be able to ask for that money. And so one of the issues that I suspect is going to be there is, what is the expectation in terms of local planning that is going to be part of local comprehensive planning programs. And we did last year have a bill in that would have required local governments to at least consider resilience planning in their comprehensive plans the next time they do their 5-year planning update. That didn't make it through last year, but those conversations have been ongoing. And again, looking into my crystal ball, I suspect that you'll see some additional efforts to make sure that we've got good state planning, we've got good regional planning, but the most important planning is ensuring that it is grounded in good local and comprehensive planning. And so the idea isn't to micromanage the plan. I understand that it's not a one-size-fits-all, but it's making sure that you're adequately translating those other plans into something that's actionable at the local level. So again, just really appreciate being a part of this conversation and looking forward to feedback with respect to how we can be better partners at the state level with our regional and local elected officials and staff. So thank you so much, Elizabeth, for having me.
All for participating. Fascinating, scary, Molly, but fascinating. And I really appreciate Lewie and Bulova featuring some of the solutions that may be helpful to our counties. We hope so. We hope this was helpful. And I'll pass back to Joe.
Yeah, so I want to thank everybody. Just to note that the resources that were identified in the 2 presentations, we'll make that a downloadable file or hyperlinks on the YouTube page for this. I did want to conclude with just kind of a follow-up, if it's okay for all 3 panelists. It was interesting kind of seeing a thread that I think Delegate Bulova ended with, which was the technical piece and the planning. And it raises the question, VACO has a longstanding position on supporting robust technical assistance at the local level. And so maybe a question starting with Lewie and then transitioning on to Dr. Mitchell. So for Lewie, what is the need of certain type of technical assistance you think the state could provide, whether it's for, a coastal PDC like yourselves or someone not in a coastal area, the Piedmont or the mountains? And then to follow that question to Dr. Mitchell, what are the things that you think are possible with Adapt Virginia, and again, needs? I mean, what kind of needs do you have in collecting data? And then this would then, I think, transfer to Delegate Bulova on kind of the budget aspect of it. What could the state put in its budget that could fund, whether it's VIMS or maybe the cooperative extension, whoever that might be, to provide that technical assistance at the local level?
All right, yeah, good question. So Joe, probably the best way that I want to start to answer that is, if the General Assembly mandates it, then local governments will do it. Local governments are an administrative arm of the state government, and that's their responsibility. And so if you remove the mandate question, then it becomes a question of, are they politically ready? And that has been the single largest probably barrier as we watch how our programs have developed over the last 5 or 6 years, the complexity of what's involved to do the work that we need to do. And we can only do it because our elected officials recognize that there was a clear and present threat to them. So they accepted the risk, they accepted the responsibility that they need to do something, that inaction was no longer acceptable. So if other communities are not politically ready, they're not ready. And if they're not ready, it doesn't make any difference what you're dangling in front of them. They're not going to move with it. And until I think elected officials from across Virginia accept that there is a clear and present danger that they've got to deal with, you're going to see a lot of inaction. and I hear it from a lot of even my own local governments, we don't have a responsibility to deal with this. And so until they come to realize what that responsibility is and how that relates to their ability to govern, you won't change. And so the ability for us to be able to drive change has been driven through that protection of public health, safety, and welfare provision. That we apply pressure on that, and we talk about it in terms of it's going to be hard to fund government. And it's going to get worse if you don't take action now to begin to slowly progress forward. And this, what we built and for the Middle Peninsula solutions, has taken many, many, many years. It's taken significant amount of legislative action at the state level to be able to do it. Now, everything that we've done, we wrote into those bills the ability for other communities, when they decided that the time was right, they've got tools in the toolbox. But they haven't decided that they want to avail themselves of that yet. So there's still more work to be done on that. What is our responsibility as a unit of government in this space?
Thanks. Okay, so I'll tackle that question of ADAPT-VA, and there's, like I said, there's a ton of data on ADAPT-VA. We're always adding to it. It's a live site. One of the things that about it is that it is our work primarily, but actually we are happy to have other people's work also on it. So we do have an area where we link to other resources, such as the Marisa resources, because there are people who are doing work outside of the coastal plain that we think is really important for people to be able to find that information and use it as we try to expand into a bigger perspective of how Virginia needs to adapt. So not just to sea level rise and tidal flooding. So that's one thing where we're actively looking to expand it. But we do continue to, as we get new grants and we do new work, we put that information up on ADAPT-VA for localities to use, or individuals or community groups. The thing that we would most be interested in hearing from communities and localities, though, is what information they need in order to be able to incorporate adaptation and climate change into their comprehensive plan. So if they're going to do that, how do they need that information conveyed? What is the best way for them to be able to parse that data, basically, so that it can be brought into a planning framework? So that kind of information is always interesting to us.
Yeah, Elizabeth, if you want, just to kind of wrap up that one, or Joe, I think that a lot of elected officials and their staff, understand the importance of these issues. I think they also are usually stressed out just trying to keep up with the administrative day-to-day things that they have to do in order to be able to keep up with development or zoning and other things. And so it is really hard. And a lot of the funding, that I recall is, one shot kind of deals. I remember we had these beautiful things up in Northern Virginia where we'd have money funding for charrettes, where you get together the communities and they'd look at these issues and they dive into it and they come up with consensus, and then the money would go away and the effort would go ahead and lose steam. And so, I do think, if we're serious about this, the state has to invest in these technical resources, make them available to localities, and make them so that they are sustainable over time. I would love to kind of hear, people's thoughts about delivery systems for that, whether we're talking ombudsmans, whether we're talking about circuit riders, whether the mechanism is, a PDC, or, whether that's, a soil and water conservation district. But I do think if we're going to make this translate into local comp planning, there has to be that sustained technical assistance. And, a great example of this, and it's since gone away, was the implementation of the Chesapeake Bay Preservation Act, where there was dedicated staff at the state level with a budget to reach out and provide grant funding for your localities to do this kind of planning. And I suspect we'll need to do something similar for this as well.
Just want to point out that and when Louis mentioned that there has to be essentially political will, right? It's political courage, right? Sometimes to bring this up because it's a problem that's here with us today, but it's going to get worse tomorrow. And we're really hard pressed to deal with today, as Delegate Bulova said. It takes political courage to focus on tomorrow, and it's very difficult. Just want to acknowledge that. But planning is key. I think we started with planning and we ended with planning. It's key.
All right. Well, thank you once again to all the panelists and our moderator. And this concludes our webinar. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.